Bond.
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 Bond. The Bond.
James Bond. Two atomic weapons.
Selector.
An atomic device.
The dragon. There is no escape.
I've got you now.
Visible nerve gas.
Spectre. This is the big one, 007.
In 1962, after major names decided to pass on the part, Sean Connery won the coveted role of Ian Fleming's James Bond. One of his biggest roles up to that point was in Darby O'Gill in The Little People, a part that after Bond producers saw it, convinced them he might have the stuff to play James Bond. Now Connery was perfect for the role. He had the right amount of ruggedness and sophistication to make audiences accept he was a globe-trotting super spy who could easily handle himself, while at the same time make the ladies swoon. Technically, Connery wasn't the first actor to play Bond. That honor would go to Barry Nelson in a 1954 CBS television production of Casino Royale. There's a piece of trivia that could win you a bar bet. But to most fans, Connery was the first and the best James Bond. Connery's films hold up remarkably well today. Dr. No as a first outing for the character is a great start. Oh, and that's not Sean Connery in the opening gun barrel sequence. The film isn't as over the top as the series would eventually become. It sounds kind of weird saying that considering the plot is about an evil scientist with metal hands who wants world domination. We're introduced to Spectre,
Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, Extortion.
the organization that will plague Bond in his future outings. Bond's CIA ally, Felix Leiter, is introduced, who will return being played by numerous actors. This time he's played by Jack Lord. Bond avoids death several times, but the threats are pretty reasonable. Death by spider, a car chase in regular cars, being shot while asleep, no being strapped to a bomb kind of stuff. Ursula Andress' entrance is still smoking. I wonder how many times kids who went to see this back in '62 replayed this scene in their heads. There are some funny things to look for now. Ursula's dialogue is all dubbed. There's the now obscure reference of Dr. No having the portrait of the Duke of Wellington, which had just been stolen when filming began. That's why Bond does a double take while walking past it. And this obviously dubbed scene.
All right, then. We'll be back. We'll be back with the dogs. Full speed ahead.
Wait a minute, didn't he take the megaphone away from his mouth? So why is his voice still amplified? Oh well. From Russia with Love quickly followed Dr. No a year later. After President Kennedy announced Ian Fleming's book was one of his favorites, this quickly helped determine choosing Bond's second story to film. The film is a much more traditional spy thriller than a big-budget Bond film. It does have a lot of the Bond things we have come to expect. The villains, the girls, even our first visit with Q. But it's pulled back and not as fantastical for a Bond film. The best scene is the fight between Bond and Red Grant, played by Robert Shaw. It's a tense scene between the two men in a train compartment. It's a suspenseful scene to see Bond seemingly so powerless and close to death. Even though Q's briefcase comes into play, the scene plays out as a brutal fight as Bond desperately fights for his life. Connery has said From Russia with Love is his favorite film he did in the series. Initially, Ian Fleming wasn't happy with the choice of Connery, but later became convinced he was the best actor for the role. He was so impressed with Connery, he gave James Bond a Scottish background in the book On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Goldfinger. Here we're heading into real Bond territory. Huge budget, cool gadgets, outlandish schemes, castration by laser, and it's a lot of fun. This is the film that really laid the groundwork for Bond films in the future. Goldfinger is sprinkled with countless memorable scenes that have now become classics. Future Bond films would be compared to a lot of the stuff they had in this one. The Fort Knox set, the deadly henchman, Bond's gadget-filled car. Sean Connery really looks like he's enjoying himself in this one. Goldfinger really lit up the Bond franchise with the merchandising too. Kids were going out to play with their own Aston Martin cars and the Oddjob figures. Probably more than any other Bond film, this is the most famous, and deservedly so. There are some things that might have been cool at the time that look a bit silly now. Like, what's with that robe and I mean, honestly, a duck on his head. But it is fun to hear Sean Connery say,
Pussy.
the only way to follow up the huge success of Goldfinger was by spending even more money and go to more exotic locations, which Thunderball did. A legal dispute over the film rights of the story surfaced, but despite it, Thunderball was released in 1965. Thunderball is another impressive film. Connery is great as usual, Largo is an intimidating villain, Domino is a very hot Bond girl, although I'll make the declaration and say Luciana Pelusi's Fiona is probably my favorite Bond girl ever. Is she considered a Bond girl if she's a villain, or is she just a bad girl? Whatever, she's my favorite. There's some things I'm not that crazy about with Thunderball. The underwater sequences, while fun to watch for a while, seem to drag, and the excitement of watching them peters out for me at the end. The gadgets start to get unnecessary. The jetpack in the opening of the film might have thrilled kids watching it back in '65. Now it looks like just a cheap escape. I think I would have liked to see what Bond would have done without it. Now, while I would recommend any of the first 4 Connery films to someone who had never seen a Bond film, You Only Live Twice is the first Bond film that I wasn't crazy about. Probably the best thing for me about the film is Ken Adams' sets. Blofeld's volcano hideout is pretty cool, and some of the smaller sets, stand out. But the majority of the film feels like a travelogue of Japan, and the story just seems to drag. The whole premise of disguising Connery as a Japanese farmer is pretty ridiculous and not the least bit convincing. He looks more like Mr. Spock to me. After only seeing hints of Blofeld in the previous films, Donald Pleasant's performance feels anticlimactic of the character. To me, this is the film that Connery starts showing his age, too. Although he still looks fit, and he also looks past his prime. He looks bored with the role, too. And while Bond always has had standout leading ladies, this time they're nice, but not very memorable. Q's mini helicopter, which of course results being used in an aerial fight, is okay. After filming, Connery quit the role, having gotten tired of repetitive plots, lack of character development, and fear of being typecast. So producers set out on the task of finding an actor who could replace Connery while at the same time win the acceptance of Bond fans.